This is a scary story I experienced while doing night shift rounds at the hospital when I was a first-year novice nurse. The hospital where I worked was a general hospital with around 100 patients, so it was quite a large hospital. Being a nurse is a very demanding job. I was gradually getting used to the job as a first-year nurse, but getting used to is a scary thing. The job of a nurse, so I was aware that getting too used to it was not good. Every day, I was chased by work, and there were times when I had no room for any margin. The senior nurses I worked with were always calm and composed, no matter what happened. Watching them handle everything with such poise, I often found myself wondering, will I ever be able to become like them? I admired their unshakable demeanor, and always felt a mix of admiration and a lack of confidence in myself. There was a senior who was both kind and strict, and guided me. This senior nurse was the epitome of the term Iron Lady, serious and experienced. She wasn't the type to joke around. During a particular break, I asked her something that had been bothering me. When doing night shift rounds, I always feel like I'm being watched around room 303 on the 3rd floor. Have you ever felt that way? During the night shift rounds, I always felt like I was being watched when I was near room 303 on the 3rd floor. It wasn't an incredibly intense feeling, so I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. However, since I always felt that gaze, I started to think, something's not right.
It's just your imagination.
Without making eye contact, she raised her gaze to about my neck and said this in a curt manner. I see. Until then, I had tried not to pay attention to it, but once I mentioned it, I realized how naturally it started to bother me. During the subsequent night shift rounds, I still felt the gaze near the hallway on the 3rd floor, around room 303. Front? Side? Back? Since I could never figure out where the gaze was coming from, I even jokingly looked up at the ceiling a few times. By the way, this is what the ceiling in the hospital where I work looks like. I looked all around, but of course, there was nothing there. Could a mouse be hiding somewhere, watching me? That was the only thought I could muster. A few days later, during another break with senior nurse, I brought up the subject of the gaze again. It's only during the night shift, but I always feel like I'm being watched near room 303. When I started talking, her expression was normal, but when I mentioned room 303, I noticed her furrow her brow.
I see. Maybe I need to tell you properly.
What? I was startled because I hadn't expected her to say something like that.
If you keep worrying about things like that, you won't be able to do this job.
When she said that, I was certain that the gaze I felt during night shifts wasn't just my imagination. So, you feel it too?
Yes, I do. But that's enough. Let's end this conversation.
She didn't seem to want to talk about it any further. Night shifts are a regular part of our job rotation, and we need to work to make a living. Getting more scared by talking about it won't solve anything. I could imagine how pointless, and even counterproductive it would be to bring up the topic. Then I realized I was being childish and, after a brief pause, said, "You're right. I'm sorry."
Good, as long as you understand.
Looking at me, the senior nurse seemed relieved and said it as if to imply, "I'm glad you understand." From that point on, I approached night shift rounds with a professional mindset. Even when I felt eyes on me near room 303, I made sure not to pay it any attention. I know I'm not imagining this stare, but I don't care. A few months later, on a summer day, I was doing my usual night shift rounds again. When I got near room 303 on the third floor, I felt an unusually strong gaze, as if it was piercing through my entire body. I was so startled that I almost jumped. I had done night shift rounds dozens of times, but I had never felt such an intense gaze before. What's happening? My body was stiff, and my shoulders tensed up with shock. This was clearly different from usual. The intensity of the gaze left me frozen, as I slowly looked around. Behind me, there was nothing. The wall, there was nothing there. Even though I usually tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, deep down I knew something must have happened in room 303. The fear I had been suppressing about room 303 suddenly surged to the surface. Is something there? Despite being overwhelmed with fear, my gaze slowly turned toward room 303. Don't look. Don't look. Even though I knew this in my mind, for some reason, my eyes kept moving slowly toward room 303. I slowly stared at every nook and cranny of the door. But there was nothing there. Thank goodness. Even though I felt relieved, I was still unable to move, as the intense gaze was still piercing through my body. And then the ceiling, the one place I hadn't looked. But there shouldn't be anything on the ceiling. Knowing this, I slowly directed my gaze upwards toward the ceiling. Each pattern on the ceiling had eyes, and all of them were looking at me. I almost screamed out loud, but I couldn't in the quiet hospital corridor late at night. I gritted my teeth and suppressed the fear rising up in my throat, running and escaping from there in a single-minded rush. That was the only time, before or since, that I had such an experience. I've been wondering why that happened on that particular day, and I've been thinking about it later on. It occurred to me. The day of the frightening experience was August 14th. Yes, it was during Obon.
Obon is a Japanese event during which the souls of ancestors are said to return and stay for several days, during the 4-day period from August 13th to 16. Sometimes, these spirits transform into eerie entities such as vengeful ghosts or curses. There are stories of strange figures appearing in homes or graveyards, accompanied by inexplicable sounds or shadows.
And one more thing. I originally had plans for the day off, but for some reason, my second-year senior strongly insisted, I really need someone to switch shifts with me just for the night shift on August 14th. And this request came back in May. Why me, months in advance? I found it strange. You all knew.